it was so stuck where it was. They sent emails and did interviews for paper, for television episodes, anything they could to spread awareness, and eventually Brandy's mother, Ellen, was sick and tired of waiting for investigators to do anything. She took it into her own hands. She decided to look at the surveillance footage that they had gone over by herself, and that's when she realized the person that investigators thought was Brandy was not her. Not at all. The lady they had said was Brandy was wearing completely different clothing, and you could see Brandy in the right clothing in the back of the frame, but she had also left alone. Now, by September of 2006, the search efforts continued and years had passed, but Brandy was still missing. In 2010, her mother would actually get a call from a man who called himself Tim and said Brandy was still alive in Kansas City, Missouri. But then he hung up the phone and never called again, and her mother could never ask him what he meant or why he was calling. Her mother kept hope alive for all of these years, and when the reconstruction of Lavender Doe came out in 2013, this was the first time she'd heard about Lavender Doe's case, and she had a fire ignited within her again. She immediately thought, could this be my daughter? Now, I'm guessing these cases were never thought to be connected for whatever reason, but that baffles me because Lavender Doe was found 7 miles from where Brandy's car was found, only 2 months after she went missing. Now, Brandy was a 23-year-old Caucasian female with brown hair and brown eyes. Her hair was slightly below her shoulders, and she had pierced ears and fringed tips on her fingers. She also stood between 4'11" and 5 foot and weighed from 120 to 130 pounds. All of these things were only slightly off from Lavender Doe, meaning this could be her. The only difference was Brandy was, of course, wearing a different outfit. She had a floral print, brown and cream colored tube top with a V-cut over the hip, and rust-colored gaucho pants with black strapless high-heeled sandals with a floral applique. This was not a lavender sweater and blue jeans, but could she have been changed? Or forced to change? Investigators thought this could be too, and dental records were immediately tested between Brandy and Lavender Doe, and this would conclude that she was not Lavender Doe. I know. Reading up on this, really thought that they were going to say that she was, but she was not. Do you remember when I told you about Joseph Burnett, a suspect in Lavender Doe's case? Well, he had gone back to prison in 2007 for not registering as a sex offender, and he got 10 years for that, meaning he would get out in 2017. And he was. And this was when he was said to meet a 28-year-old named Felicia Pearson. And according to the Nowhere Dispatch podcast, they would actually start to live together in a rundown motel until July 20th, when Felicia would go missing. 4 days later, her body would be found in Longview, and it was found because her purple fingernails were sticking out of the leaves on the ground. Now, the next day, Joseph would be arrested, but not for murder, for failing to register as a sex offender once again. By August 21st, 2008, Joseph would actually confess to killing Felicia Pearson by strangling her with a rope, and then he dropped another bombshell. He had done the same thing to Lavender Doe back in 2006, but he didn't know her name either. He didn't know who she was. Joseph said that she had convinced him to get into his vehicle because she was selling things from a magazine, and he had refused that but said he would pay her for sexual activities, and she agreed. So she had gotten in, they had done the deed, but allegedly she had stolen money from him. And that is why he killed her, but left $40 in her pocket so that she could get the money she earned. He believed her real name may have been Ashley, but he had no idea. But his DNA was a match to the semen found in Lavender Doe. He was her killer. With a murder case technically closed, it was heartbreaking to know that the victim was still a Jane Doe, and that is why that year, 2018, the DNA Doe Project would get to work on Lavender Doe's case, hoping to identify her. Now, if you don't know, the DNA Doe Project actually is full of volunteers, anybody who wants to work on these cases to help identify victims who are Jane and John Does. This means internet sleuths like me and you who genuinely want to help in these cases can, and it can make a huge difference, because 3 volunteers who did not have a background in any of this, named Lori Gaff, Kevin Lord, and Missy Koski, began to work on the Lavender Doe case. They had never even met in real life, but they started working together on it. Now, because of this, Kevin had started taking private investigator classes. Missy was actually adopted, and she found her father on this website, which is why she was so involved in it. And Lori had always watched all the true crime cases, fictional, non-fictional, and she really wanted to help out with the real thing. So all of them combined got together and started working. Now, the organization actually raised $1,400 to analyze her DNA profile, and these volunteers searched through public records from MySpace profiles, and they did a lot of hard work on their own time because they wanted to help. And they eventually found she was of Czech ancestry, and they actually identified a descendant that lived about 30 miles from where her body had been found. Now, this woman was in her 50s. She had no idea what genealogy was, what they were trying to do, what they were asking of her. But eventually, when they explained it further, she finally said, yes, you can have my DNA to test it against Lavender Doe. And this came back to be a miracle, because not only was she some distant relative, she was actually first cousins once removed. So they just had to narrow down the family tree even more from there. An uncle of this woman had a daughter named Robin, and looking into this Robin, they found that she had died a month before Lavender Doe was found dead, and Robin was said not to have a very stable life. She was an alcoholic, she had been arrested several times, and she also had several different husbands, one of which had the last name of Dodd, and from there they could find anyone else with the last name of Dodd to possibly connect. And that is when they found Lavender Doe's real name. It had taken 12 years to identify her, but on February 11th, 2019, it was officially released to the public that Lavender Doe was Dana Lynn Dodd. Now, Dana was 21 years old at the time. She was between 5'3" to 5'5", with strawberry blonde hair, and her mother, who was Robin, had that, very unstable life, and had actually left her as a baby, so she didn't really deal with her mother. But her father was also homeless, and so Dana actually had to live with her stepmother in Arizona until she was 14. At this point, she was sent to Florida to be with family there, because she did have such a kind of a rough and rocky childhood that it had led to behavioral issues as she got to be a teenager. The family in Florida was actually her older sister, Amanda, who was 9 years older than her, who took her in. Amanda would be talked to about Dana and said that at this point, Dana became very different. She was hanging out with the wrong kind of people. She was doing drugs. She was becoming rebellious, and her sister couldn't handle her. She didn't know what to do, and Dana eventually ran away and actually decided to join a magazine sales crew that traveled around and eventually landed her in Texas. Her sister said, "I think after all the years she thought she had nobody. I think that's why she didn't reach out to us." Her best friend from that time, named Bobby Lynn Hodges, actually blames herself for what happened to Dana, because she said that she spent a lot of time with Dana, that they were the ones kind of doing drugs together and doing rebellious things, but they were like family. They loved each other. But then it got to the point where Bobby got pregnant and wanted to keep the baby and wanted to stop doing drugs, but Dana didn't. And so she basically decided that she was going to need to separate from Bobby, and Dana began to inject herself with heroin. She would steal things from Bobby, and Bobby had to kick her out because she was being so disruptive, and Bobby was now pregnant and had somebody else to think about. And the last words that Dana said to her was, "You're my last person. Nobody else will help me." It seems like Dana Dodd's life was, from the very beginning, a tough one, and that before she could become a woman that, she, I'm sure, wanted to be, and before she could really see a life past all of that rebelliousness, her life was taken from her. Now, thankfully, this case is solved. We know a killer, we know a name, and that is all beautiful. And the only thing is, Brandy Wells, who is thought to be Lavender Doe, still has not been found. So if you have any information, please contact the Longview Police Department at 903-237-1110. And I think that something we should all think about because of this case is that we have so much power at our fingertips now with the internet, with all of the information that is so readily available to us. It can kind of lighten the load when you're thinking about how many unsolved cases there are. And if you're just watching the unsolved videos, what's that really doing? Well, that's actually doing a lot. It's spreading information. It's making you want to research more. It's making you want to help. And who knows, you watching right now could be the next person to solve a case. And that's not too far-fetched. That is not too crazy to say. You don't have to be a top investigator. You can be someone watching this right now that has a completely different field. You could be a teenager, you could be a mom, you could be a nurse. You could be anyone. And you could solve the case. And I truly hope, and I know, that all of you out there can do it and will want to do it too. And don't put a ton of pressure on yourself, but just know you have that power. And it's not something that just me doing these cases can do, or just somebody who's gone to school for this can do. You can too. Don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay? Bye.
Hola, me llamo Dani Arranz, soy especialista en retoque fotográfico y experto certificado por Adobe. Mi especialidad es la fotografía.
You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the solved case of the Beauty Queen Killer. And this is the first episode in Wicked Winter. Now, this was a killer that was identified from the very first victim, and yet no one could catch him. It was a 6-week span of horrific crimes, but nobody knew where to find him or how to make him stop. His criminal record started long before this, and yet he just always happened to get away with it. But he wouldn't this time. By the way, I am posting so much this month for Wicked Winter. I did this series last December and you guys really loved it. I will leave a playlist of all those videos down below, but I am doing it again this year, and I hope you are just as excited to hear these cases, because they are going to be anywhere from just completely wicked to Christmas themed and anything in between. So yeah, if that's something you're interested in, please subscribe. I would absolutely love if you did. And if you wanted to thumbs up this video and leave a nice comment down below, I always love replying to those. But now let's get back to the story. So it was 1984 in Florida, and Rosario Gonzalez was a 20-year-old model who was living in Miami and working there as well at the Miami Grand Prix for race car drivers. And she was a spokesmodel. She handed out aspirin to the race car drivers, and she was very well known by all of them. She was described as sweet and innocent. She had just recently gotten engaged, and she was described as the type of girl that you would marry. But on February 26th, she would be working and she would just disappear. And the last time anyone ever saw her was walking alongside a race car driver. A week later, another woman would go missing in the Miami area, and this was on March 5th when 23-year-old Elizabeth Kenyon went missing as well, and she actually went by Beth. She was a teacher at a local high school, and she would often teach the special needs children and really help them out in the areas that they struggled with. She was also a cheerleading coach, but she really cared about the children and their well-being, and especially their mental health, and she even talked down a student from their suicidal thoughts at one point. And she was just such a wonderful soul, and her heart was so pure, and she always kept in contact with her family. And that is why immediately Beth was reported missing, because they knew that she would not do this to make them anxious for her at all. She always kept in contact with them. However, investigators just brushed this off as a runaway and didn't want to do anything with this case, but her parents were fighters, and they were not going to let this be the end of it. They went and hired private investigators to do their own research into where Beth had gone. They went to Beth's apartment. They found kind of a whole photo album of pictures she had, and they took that out and they started going to all the areas that were around this high school she worked at to see if anyone had seen her the day she disappeared. And that is when they would go to a local gas station, and the gas station attendant would know quite a few things. Now, while flipping through this photo album, the gas station attendant recognized Beth and said that that very day she was there getting gas, and then he saw a picture of a man, and he said, but this man was there too. He said when Beth was getting gas, this man pulled up and offered to pay for it for her, and then Beth had told him that they were going to go out and do a photo shoot together, and she was going to be the model. Upon hearing this tip, private investigators went to Beth's parents and said, can you identify this man for me, because he was said to be with your daughter the day she disappeared? And immediately her parents said, oh yeah, that's Chris Wilder. That's Beth's ex that she dated for a while, but when he asked her to marry him, she said no.
Hola, soy Patricio Beteo y soy ilustrador. He realizado ilustración editorial para más de 30 libros infantiles y cientos de revistas. Además, he participado en desarrollo visual para un capítulo de Love, Death and Robots de Netflix. Algo que disfruto mucho es el diseño de personajes.
No. And Beth's mom also said that she had come up to her and said, Mom, I've never even kissed the guy, and he asked me to marry him. Apparently they had just gone on a few dates. It wasn't like they were really deep into a relationship when he asked her to marry him. It was just a few dates in, and he had already done so, so of course she said no. But her mother also said that Chris was the perfect gentleman. So when the investigators began to search for Christopher Bernard Wilder, they went to his home and they started to talk to him. However, it would be what they would find in his trash that would really make a difference, because they began to piece together the previous missing persons case that we were talking about before Beth, of Rosario. You see, they found a photograph of Christopher in the trash with his race car at the very race car track that Rosario had gone missing from. He raced his Porsche 911 there quite often and actually knew Rosario and would photograph her often. And they had known each other pretty well, and multiple witnesses had seen a guy matching his description with her that day. And Rosario and Beth looked incredibly alike, and investigators began to believe this wasn't a coincidence. Now, they actually talked to Christopher at his home. However, he said he didn't know what happened to Beth, that he actually hadn't spoken to her in a month because they weren't dating. She had said no to his marriage proposal, and they were still friends, but they hadn't hung out all the time. And after the police left from the questioning, Beth's parents actually contacted the FBI for help, because after this, Christopher disappeared and they could no longer find him at his house, and they believed there was a possible abductor on the loose. 13 days later, on March 18th, another woman would go missing, this time from Merritt Island, which was still in Florida, but it was 3 hours from Miami, and this was a 21-year-old Teresa Waite Ferguson, who would last be seen with a man matching Christopher's description at the Merritt Island Mall. 2 days later, 19-year-old Linda Grover would go missing as well, this time 4 hours from Merritt Island in Tallahassee. She had been a student at Florida State University, and she had gone missing from the Governor's Square Mall. But thankfully, she would be found alive. Police found Linda in a hotel in Bainbridge, Georgia, and she was banging on the walls, screaming at the top of her lungs, and she had locked herself in this bathroom. They rescued her, they took her to the hospital, and when they let her get some rest, they began to question her on what had happened and why she had locked herself in, why the police needed to be called. She had said that she had been at the Governor's Square Mall that day when she had been approached by a man who had said that he was a photographer and that he would really like to shoot her as his model, and he believed she was perfect for the shoot. He said his portfolio was in his car, so if she'd come out there, he would show it to her, and she thought because it was daylight out that she wouldn't really need to worry about it too much, so she did follow him. However, he would then shove her into his car after beating her unconscious, and finally, on the ride there, she would wake up and he would notice that she was waking up, and he would proceed to tie her up, put her in a sleeping bag, and put her in his trunk before driving to the Glen Oaks motel. Once there, he began to torture Linda and sexually assault her, and even put copper wires on her feet, where he proceeded to electrocute her. And she was also blinded by super glue, and this torture went on for hours before she finally, in some sort of miracle, got away from him and ran to the bathroom, where she locked herself in and began to scream bloody murder. And because of her screams, he was thought to have been worried that someone would catch him, and so he fled with all of his belongings. Now, Linda would be given a photographic lineup where multiple different men would be posted, and she would pick out if her abductor was in one of those photos, and she immediately picked Christopher Wilder. Now, 2 days later, he would find his next victim. He had traveled from Georgia to Beaumont, Texas, and this had been almost 9 hours away. He completely fled, and he would also have taken out $19,000 from his bank account. It was caught on the cameras at the bank, so this would mean he would be able to pay cash everywhere, so he couldn't be traced, and this would just make it even harder for investigators. However, he would not be abducting a woman the next day, because he had approached a woman named Terry and asked about this photo shoot, and she had actually denied him. But then the next day was March 23rd, and 23-year-old Terry Walden would disappear from the local mall, and witnesses would say she had been with a man matching Christopher's description that day before she disappeared, that a man like that had approached her. She wasn't necessarily with him. However, 2 days prior, witnesses said that she had actually been seen with him at her school, Lamar University, and had then allegedly told him that she didn't want what he was trying to give her, which was thought to be the photo shoot. Terry was not only a nursing student, but a wife and a mother. She also had a rust-colored 1981 Mercury Cougar that was now missing from the parking lot as well. Investigators began to think that this was Christopher's new ride, that when he took Terry, he also took her car. The same day Terry was abducted, Teresa Ferguson, who had gone missing from Merritt Island previously, was officially found. She was in Canaveral Groves and had been beaten by a tire iron and strangled, and investigators and FBI alike knew that they now had a serial killer on their hands, and yet the only things that had been talked about in the media about Christopher was after the first two ladies had gone missing when he was being looked into as a suspect. However, it didn't ever say his name or his picture. It just said that he was a race car driver and that he was Australian, which Christopher was, but nobody actually said his name. 2 days later, on March 25th, 21-year-old Suzanne Logan would go missing from Penn Square Mall in Oklahoma. This was at such an incredible rate that these women were going missing, and it was absolutely terrifying. The next day, Terry Walden would be found nearby where she had gone missing. She was found in a canal, and she had been stabbed to death in the breast 43 times. Now, where it was said that Christopher had taken Terry's car, he had left his own car there. And so, of course, the police took his car in to search it for evidence, and they actually found DNA of Teresa Ferguson inside, matching Christopher to her disappearance as well. They were certain now that it was Christopher Wilder who was committing all of these murders, except they still couldn't find him, and they even had an APB out on the Mercury Cougar that he was said to be driving. The day after that, it was March 27th, when Suzanne Logan's body would be found by a fisherman in Junction City, Kansas. Now, it was found that a man matching Christopher's descriptions had checked in to an I-35 Inn, and this was the night prior to finding Suzanne's body, and then he would drive to Junction City where he would stab her to death in the woods. She had been bitten in the breast and had her hair all over her body shaved off. Then on March 28th, they would finally get a tip on Christopher's location. This was the first time they had ever been able to track him down and know where he was at a specific time and not after he already fled. And this was in Rifle, Colorado, where a hotel had got a hit on using a Visa card that the police knew Christopher had stolen. It was from someone he knew and was not his, but he had been said to steal it and use it, and they got a hit on this card. And so they rushed there, and they got there the next morning, and he had already fled. He was headed to Grand Junction, Colorado, where he would find his next victim at the Macy's shopping mall. This time it was a 19-year-old named Cheryl Bonaventure, and they would be seen together in a diner in Silverton, and they were telling the employees that they were headed to Las Vegas, that they were going to stop in Durango, and that they were also a married couple. The next day, the two were seen and checking into a hotel in Page Boy Motel in Page, Arizona, and they were still saying that they were a married couple. However, after this, she vanished. Cheryl was no longer seen with him or seen at all. The next day, it was April 1st, and the Meadows Mall had obviously not heard about this possible serial killer on the loose, because they were not only a mall, which was what was Christopher's perfect place to go find his victims, but they were also going to be hosting a 17 magazine photo shoot competition, meaning that there would be many models in this mall, which is exactly what Christopher liked. It would be no surprise to police when they found out that this was happening, and that also a 17-year-old girl named Michelle Korfman had gone missing. Now, this was the first time Michelle even tried to go out and do any sort of modeling, so of course if someone approached her and said, "Hey, I would love to give you a job," she would have taken it. She was also only 17, probably very naive. Upon hearing that this happened, the police immediately demanded all of the photographs that had been taken that day to be sent to them so they could comb through them and see if they could see Christopher at all or find anything strange. And they would. They would find the perfect picture of Christopher Wilder staring up at the 17-year-old girl who would go missing. It was completely eerie knowing who he was and what he did. April 4th, he would abduct a 16-year-old girl named Tina Marie Rizzico from Torrance, California, in a local mall where she was just going around looking for a job when he approached her saying that he had a job for her, that she would be the perfect model, and once again, he lured her in. From there, she would vanish. However, 6 days later, she would be seen in another mall helping in the abduction of Dawnette Wilt. This was in Indiana. However, April 12th, Dawnette would be seen again. She had crawled out of the woods and was on the side of the road when she was thankfully rescued in New York. She had been stabbed multiple times by Christopher Wilder. She had survived and could identify him as being her abductor and her attacker, and she could have died that day, but she didn't. Then also in New York, 33-year-old Beth Dodge would go missing, as well as her Pontiac Firebird, and this was at the Eastview Mall, and Tina would be driving the Mercury Cougar behind them. Strangely enough, Tina would then be dropped off at the Logan Airport, given money to buy an airplane ticket, and she went home back to Los Angeles completely safe. But she had plenty to tell investigators. Tina said the day she went with Christopher when he lured her in, saying that she was going to be doing a photo shoot. He really did take her to a local park to do a photo shoot. They were taking pictures, and then all of a sudden he pointed a gun at her head, told her to get in the car, and so she did, and he took her to a local hotel where he began to sexually assault her and electrocute her. This was continuing for so long, except for when he heard something on the TV and immediately stopped. You see, this would be when Christopher would see himself on the TV, because he was being placed on the 10 most wanted list that was publicized everywhere, and anybody watching TV would know his face and know to look out for him. And immediately he wanted to run, and he told Tina that he would let her go if she would help him abduct another victim. And so she did so. She helped abduct Dawnette Wilt, who Christopher took to a hotel room, sexually assaulted, then took her to the woods and tried to kill her. However, she survived, and Christopher had a feeling that he hadn't killed her, went back, but Dawnette had already escaped. That's when Christopher decided they needed a new car, and that is why Beth Dodge was abducted, mainly for her car, and Tina followed him like he had told her. And then Tina said that Christopher took Beth out to the woods, shot her twice, and then took Tina to the airport and dropped her off and let her go. And Tina said she didn't know why he did that, and she also didn't know why she didn't run the multiple times she could have. But for those of you who don't know, situations like these can bring out many different responses in different people, because not only is there fight or flight, there is also freeze and fawn. And this is something that I want to tell you guys a little bit about, because I think in all of these cases it can truly give you a different perspective on what these people are going through at the time. Now, of course, we all know what a fight response is: to confront the threat until it's no longer endangers your safety. And it's for individuals who will fight tooth and nail to survive, to get out of that situation. And in this case, that is like Dawnette, who did not just sit there and die. She crawled to the road to get picked up so she could survive. She did not just let herself succumb to what she could have just let happen to her. There is also flight, which means you run from the threat at all costs. You don't care what will happen if you do. You don't think of the repercussions. You'd rather be in danger running than if you just stayed still, because that's just your response. You just want to get out of there, no matter if it's worse in the situation or not. That doesn't even occur in the brain. It's just your natural response to flee. And then we have freeze, which occurs when individuals just shut down and are unable to process the situation in front of them. They are often not able to fight in the moment. They have fear enveloping them. They don't even think that fighting is an option because their whole system has shut down. Now, I'm not sure that anyone in this case necessarily fits the freeze response, but I do think that flight would be Linda Grover, who immediately upon finding a moment that she could get up and leave, did so and ran into the bathroom to get away. Now, the one that I have been diving into learning more about recently is one that not a lot of people know about, and that is the fawn response. Now, this is individuals that I would say have the ultimate survival instinct. They are chameleons in the face of predators. They do what it takes to lessen the threat against them, meaning if they have to become friends with the threat, they will. And if that stops them from being prey, they will do whatever it takes. They learn exactly what the predator wants to maximize their chance of survival. Now, I do see fawn response in a lot of child/teen abductions, and I do wonder if this is because it would be easier to let yourself succumb to doing whatever the abductor wants when you are a child or a younger victim, and you do kind of still see an adult as more superior, whereas an adult in this situation would be a little bit harder to do whatever this abductor or predator says. And I do wonder if there's a correlation there. However, this can happen with anyone at any age, but it's just something that I have seen in many different cases. And of course, the victims here that were older didn't necessarily show any signs of having the fawn response. However, Tina really did, and she was the 16-year-old, so this would make sense. I think Tina was doing this without even knowing what she was doing, and because of this, Christopher trusted her enough to let her help and then let her go. Now, what I've researched from Stockholm Syndrome is a bit different than the fawn response. They do seem as though they could go hand in hand. However, there is a little bit of
There are no shortcuts. It takes work. It's that
a difference. You see, Stockholm Syndrome is the psychological alliance of a victim to their captor due to a relief feeling as they're being chosen to survive in the moment. Say there are multiple different victims and they are the ones that are chosen to survive in that moment. They get a sense of relief, a rush, you can say, that's just overwhelming joy that they are still alive, and this causes them to have some sort of bond with their captor. It's a strong sense of gratitude that triumphs all hate because they get to survive at least for that moment. And I can see when your brain is in such a stressful situation how you could go into that mode, because your brain can only handle so much torture and stress and just complete terror. And so if that can grant you a little bit of peace in the moment, I could see how some of our brains do go to that. However, just like fawn, Stockholm Syndrome has the main symptom of being very hypervigilant of what the predator wants in order to survive, and the emotions of them in order to stay safe, and just knowing, kind of trying to predict their next move so you can be on top of it too. And of course, minds are very complex, and there can be different responses for different people at different times, and you can have, two different responses at the same time, and you can never really fully, I don't think, say what somebody is going to do based on what they've done before or just based on research. I mean, I think so much more goes into it, and the way our brains work in stressful, traumatic situations is so intriguing to me, and I really hope that this kind of taught you a little bit that you didn't know before. But please do remember, I am not a psychologist, psychiatrist, or therapist, and this is just stuff that I have researched on my own and also put with some experiences that I have as well. So I hope that I gave you that information in the best way possible. And of course, I always urge you to do more research on stuff like that. But yes, I thought that that was very intriguing and could definitely tell you a little more as to why Tina continued to follow him around and then why Christopher let her go, because I don't think it's as simple as he liked her, because in the mind of a serial killer, that's not necessarily enough. But it was now April 13th and Christopher Wilder was on the move again, this time in Colebrook, New Hampshire, and he was at Vic's Gary Station, which was a gas station in this area that was kind of close by the Canadian border, and he had stopped to ask a gas station attendant what all he would need to go through this border. He was planning to flee the country. However, a miracle would happen instead, because two state troopers would pull up to this gas station just by chance. Their names were Leo Jellison and Wayne Fortier, and they would pull up and immediately recognize Christopher, but also his car, which was the Pontiac Firebird that belonged to Beth Dodge. The officers jumped out and began to ask Christopher if they could ask him some questions. However, Christopher ran back to his car to grab his gun. Now at this point, Jellison would run up behind him and try to grab the gun as he was kind of holding him from behind, and that's when two shots would ring out. Jellison had been shot in the chest, but Christopher had been in front of him, meaning that the gun had gone through him too. Christopher instantly died at the age of 39 at 2 p.m. that day, and Jellison actually survived this incident, and a killer had been caught. But this had been far too easy on him. In the eyes of some, they believed that he didn't ever have to be punished for what he did, and they were very angered by this. Now, the FBI said it brought a feeling of relief that he is no longer a fugitive, that there will be no new victims, but there are so many questions to ask him. The one person who could answer all of them is dead. A month later, on May 3rd, the body of Cheryl Bonaventura would be found in Utah. She had been shot to death after going on the road trip with Christopher, where she was telling everyone that she was married to him. Now, on May 11th, the body of the 17-year-old Michelle Korfman from the 17 magazine photo shoot would also be found in California and identified in June, meaning that out of 9 of Christopher's victims, 7 had been found and 2 had not. That had been Rosario Gonzalez and Elizabeth Kenyon, who had been his first 2 victims, or what are thought to be his first 2 victims. 3 of those 9 victims had actually survived. But as amazing as that is, they still had to endure that torture and live with it and heal from that. And that is probably one of the hardest things you could ever have to do. Linda Grover after screaming in the hotel room, Donette Willett after crawling to safety, and Tina Marie Rizzico, who was let go after being put through a tremendous amount of psychological torture as well as physical. Many believed there were many more victims connected to the beauty queen killer, as everyone was calling Christopher Wilder, but nobody could properly say if there was. But before we get into the possible cases that could be connected to Christopher Wilder, let's look into his past, because of course we all want to know what made him this way. Why did he do this? Well, he was born on March 13th, 1945 in Sydney, Australia, to an American father and an Australian mother. He had actually almost died at childbirth, and then again at 2 because he almost drowned. At this point, he would also start to have convulsions and had to be resuscitated. However, except for his health problems, he had a pretty normal, happy childhood. He was a peeping Tom from a young age, but nothing really too terribly awful would occur to him or because of him until he was 17 years old, when he sexually assaulted a 13-year-old girl with 2 other boys, and he denied this but was sentenced to probation for a year and sentenced to electroshock therapy, which was supposed to kind of cure him of these thoughts and these actions. However, it was said to have just made it worse. At that point, he wanted to shock women, and as we know now, that is what he eventually would do. Now, this is what we had talked about in the David Michael Kruger case about some of these forms of therapy that these institutes were doing to try to get them to stop being this way, only really made them 10 times worse. Now, can we blame that on what he would eventually do? I'm not sure, because he was already showing those malicious, monstrous behaviors before then. I'm just not sure that it helps in any way. 5 years later, Christopher was 22, and he would get married for a week before getting divorced. And then the year after that was 1969, when he would move from Australia to the United States. And this was said to be because he had been blackmailing a young high school girl for nude photos, and he was being caught for that, so he fled. This is where he started a construction company. It was said to make really good money. He didn't stop assaulting young girls, though. He, in fact, just had his wealth help him in that way. He loved to do photography on the side, so that became part of his.
Say goodbye to your body hair with Veet Easy Gel Cold Wax Strips. In a variety of sizes, tailored to different body parts. Whether for your legs, underarms, bikini, or face. For up to 28 days of smoothness. Enjoy salon perfect results at home with Veet Easy Gel Cold Wax Strips.
His MO, and he, because he had money, could get these girls to really believe he could do something to help their modeling careers. 8 years later, in 1977, Christopher would be arrested for forcing a high school girl to perform sexual acts on him, or she would be beaten by him. Now, allegedly, at the trial, the judge asked if he was sane enough to stand trial, and he just flat out said that he had been pleasuring himself at the thought of assaulting young girls twice a week. And he actually said that in a much more horrific manner than I'm willing to say on this channel. 3 years later, his first abduction was thought to occur on April 13th, 1980, of Carla Hendry, who was in Massachusetts when he attempted to kidnap her. Thankfully, she did escape, though. 2 years after this, Christopher would succeed in an abduction, and this was of 2 15-year-old girls who he forced to pose nude. He was back in Australia visiting his parents, so this is where he abducted the girls, and his license plate was seen from the abduction, and it was traced back to him. He was caught, he was arrested. However, his parents posted a $350,000 bail, and he was allowed to go back to the United States, where he went to Florida. And they were still awaiting the whole process of getting his trial to go through 2 years later, which is why in 1984 he was still in Florida and this spree of killing began. Now, we know about 9 victims, however, there are thought to have been possibly so many more. Now, a case that is really theorized to be Christopher Wilder's doing is that of the Wanda Beach murders of Mariana Smith and Christine Sharrock near Sydney, Australia on January 11th of 1965. Christopher lived in Australia at this time until 1969, so he would have been in the area. He was thought to be the #1 suspect in this case. However, it was long before his murders were thought to begin. He was just abducting at this point and assaulting, so it can't truly be said, and there's no way to link him to it. A bit later, there was a 17-year-old named Mary Opez, who was from Fort Myers, Florida, who would go missing on January 16th, 1981, and then another girl named Mary Hare would disappear a month later from the same location, and Christopher was thought to be the abductor. Mary Hare was actually found a month later, stabbed to death. The next year, in 1982, 2 women's bodies were found near a property that Christopher owned. Once again, couldn't be linked. Then in 1983, a year before this 6-week murder spree had occurred, Nancy K. Brown, who was a 25-year-old, went missing from Cocoa Beach, Florida, and she would be found in the Canaveral Groves, which was where Teresa Ferguson, who was linked to Christopher, was found. This could just be a coincidence, or it could be a dumping ground that Christopher knew well. A month later, in the same location as where Nancy K. was abducted in Cocoa Beach, Florida, Tammy Lynn Laporte would disappear. And I've done a whole video on her very strange case, but she was also a model who would have been his perfect victim. Sherry Lynn Ball was a 20-year-old model who went missing from the Boca Raton, Florida area, and she was found in New York, and she was a model. She'd been abducted that October, but again, no links were found. There was another case of a 15-year-old named Colleen Osborne who disappeared from the Daytona Beach, Florida area on March 15th of 1984. Now, this would be between the murder spree. It was actually in the middle of Christopher's murder spree between the second and the third victim, which is why this one specifically is really thought to be connected to Christopher. Christopher was also found to be staying in a Daytona Beach hotel the day she went missing and checked out that day, but there's no actual connection to have said that her case was connected to Christopher's, and she was found a few weeks later partially buried. However, he didn't often bury his victims, but the methods in which he murdered and disposed of the bodies were also different, that it didn't necessarily mean that that couldn't have been Christopher. Now, Christopher's brother Stephen was interviewed after he was caught, and he said, "He must have snapped. He went crazy. He wasn't the same person I knew. It's terrible. It's a mess." He also said that Christopher was a loner who wasn't a millionaire but claimed to be one to impress women. He said he always had trouble establishing relationships, which can be a form of attachment issues, which we have talked about before, and it can be called RAD, reactive attachment disorder. But Stephen ultimately said he was happy his brother had been stopped. Christopher's therapist that he had had for a very long time before these murders began said he was a deeply disturbed walking time bomb, and investigators said in a homicide investigation you have to be methodical and discount nothing. In this business, you don't deal only with the deceased but with the life of the potential suspect, because he could get the electric chair for first-degree murder. There's nothing you can do first. We had no proof that he was a maniac. But this is what frustrates me so much about this society. I mean, this therapist had seen how deeply disturbed he was, and yet nothing had happened. Now, action needs to be taken before the killing begins, not when they prove that they will kill. I hear so often that people who we know as a society, as doctors, as therapists, that they are not right in their minds. We know this, and yet I hear so often, well, nothing can be done until they get bad enough. And what does bad enough mean? That they're going to kill someone? That they're going to hurt themselves? How many innocent lives have to be taken before we realize that something needs to happen prior to them getting that far? That's all I'm going to say. This case could have been stopped if this therapist had maybe talked to more people, had maybe gotten him help, had maybe put him in an area where he was safe from himself and for others. And that's something that I would really like to see change in the way that this world works, because it could have changed everything, could have saved so many people, so many traumatic events that would happen to them, and could have saved their lives. I know this was a super long video. I hope you enjoyed it. You guys really liked the long video I did on David Michael Krueger, and I want to give you what you want, and so I really hope you enjoyed this. I loved doing a longer case, and I hope you know that doing these serial killer cases to me isn't about the serial killer. It's about the victims. I do enjoy looking into the mind of killers so that we can potentially stop them in the future. But to me, the story is more about the victims, and I did try to add as many personal information bits that I could in here about each girl. However, there wasn't a ton, unfortunately, because a lot of people don't focus on them, which I think is heartbreaking, but I did the best that I could, and I hope that you can see that. If you're excited for Wicked Winter and want longer videos, please give this a thumbs up, and don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.
During these exceptional months, FXCM's team ensured client service remained our core focus. With 7-second chat pickup times and
Love is such a fragile thing. Don't be the person to take advantage of it. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my Foul Play February series. I'm Brooke McKenna, but this case is one that was 48 years old. And it just shows that time means nothing and passion means everything. And I do want to thank the Long Dance podcast, which is an 8-hour long podcast, 8 different episodes of this case, and without them I would have not nearly enough information to tell you guys. So I just want to thank Eric Pruitt and Drew Adamex for their work and their time and their energy, and it's such a brilliantly produced podcast, so I will have it all linked down below for you all to go check out. But I'm going to be doing a slight retelling of it here today. By the way, I'm posting every single day this month for Foul Play February, so if you like this content and you're excited, give this a thumbs up, make sure you're subscribed, and let's get back to the story. So it began in North Carolina, where a 20-year-old named Patricia Ann Mann lived in Sanford. She was a type that was a good girl, but also loved to have fun. Her family was a priority, but so was her social life, and she was a wonderful student who never missed curfew. She just really knew how to balance it all out. Ever since she was a kid, she would play nurse with her family and friends in the basement of her house and would pretend it was a hospital, and this eventually grew into a career choice in high school, which is what she started working towards. But like I said, she was all about balance, about work and play, and so on the weekends she would often go see her cousin, and he was about her same age, and so he would bring over his own friends, and this is where she met a 19-year-old named Jesse Allen McBain. Now, he was a good guy. He was the type that was a football player but would go drink with his buddies. He was an all-around type of guy that nobody had anything bad to say about. He was a really strong guy, but he never thought it was necessary to pick a fight or get into trouble. And not only was he strong, he was also smart and could even recite back lines of a TV show that he had just watched. He was voted most likely to succeed in his high school yearbook. And together they were the perfect pair, but the only problem was distance. You see, he lived in Pittsburgh and she lived in Sanford, which was about a 21-minute drive, and it made it hard for them being just students. Jesse would drive to see her using his parents' car on the weekends, but Patricia's hard work was going to start paying off. She was working so hard to be a nurse, and she was finally accepted into Watts Hospital, which was a training program for nurses and one of the best in the state. The only problem was it was in Durham, which was an hour away from Jesse and her family. She went there freshman year while Jesse was in his last year of high school, and once he graduated, he went to North Carolina State University, which was only 30 minutes away from Watts Hospital, so they were a little bit closer and they stayed together. Of course, like every couple, they had their ups and downs, and Jesse was the type of outgoing guy that all of the girls would flock to, especially at this new school, and Patricia had more of a maturity to her. She was a little bit older. Girls do mature earlier, and so she was really starting to feel that with Jesse, that he wasn't at quite her maturity level, but she wanted to stick it out until he was. It was a trying time for them, but they did stay together, and during Patricia's junior year and Jesse's sophomore year, he actually gave her a pre-engagement ring to kind of solidify their bond. They seemed like the most realistic fairy tale love story you could ever get, and it seemed like it would last forever. But on February 12th of 1971, everything changed. Patricia had a test at school. It was a Friday, and normally she would go home with a friend, a classmate of hers, whose hometown was also Sanford, so they would drive back together normally on the weekends, except for this day, Patricia was taking a test. They were all taking a test, but she was taking more time than her classmate, and so she went ahead and told her classmate to go ahead and go home. And she was just going to stay at the dorms that weekend. But Jesse had gone back from his college back to his home in Pittsburgh, and he was just going to hang out there. He would normally get the family car, which he had to share with his brother, on Saturdays, and his brother would get it on Fridays, so he didn't have a car to go get Patricia even if he wanted to. But that night, he had actually been offered the car because his birthday was coming up, and his mother said, "Why don't you ask your brother if you can just trade the car so you can take Patricia to the Valentine's Day dance at her school tonight?" And his brother agreed, and so he got to take the car out that Friday, and he headed right to Watts Hospital to surprise his girlfriend. It was a small group of people at this dance, about probably 50 people dancing in this small basement area, and it was just perfect for Patricia and Jesse to be able to spend time together. But at about 11:30, they decided to leave the dance, and Patricia checked out of the Watts Hospital where she was staying in the dormitory, and they had extended the curfew to 1 a.m. Normally it was about, I think, 11, and they extended it to 1 a.m. because of this dance to let the students kind of hang out afterwards. And so she checked out, and they got in Jesse's car and headed north on Maryland Avenue, but were never seen after that. But the house mother at Watts Hospital dormitories went in to check on all of the girls at about 1:10, making sure they all made curfew. But Patricia wasn't there, and it was 10 minutes after she was supposed to be, and she was not the type to even be late, nonetheless completely miss curfew at all. And so they got really, really worried and immediately called the police. And the next morning, they got up and they went down there to talk to them. At the same time, Jesse's family back at home were worried because he had never brought the car back so his brother could use it that day. Remember, they switched, so his brother would have had it on Saturday, and he never brought the car back home. They called his dormitory to see if he was there, and they said he wasn't there either. When Patricia's friends and classmates went down to the police station to tell them about the fact that she was missing, they just said that she was probably sleeping around and she'd be home after she was done. And with this, they were so angered by that answer. Of course you would be if you know that that's not your friend that's going to be doing that. And then the officer said, oh, maybe the couple just eloped and didn't want any of you to know, and so they'll be back later. And again, to this, they said there was no reason they would have eloped. Everybody wanted them to get married. They would have loved to be at the wedding. There was no reason it would have had to have been secretive, and it just didn't make sense. But they said that they would have to wait 48 hours to begin searching without evidence, and so her friends and classmates went and started calling hospitals and seeing if there was possibly a car accident that had happened or any accident at all, but there wasn't. And with more time ticking away, they just went ahead and started searching for her themselves. One of the places these nurses looked first was called Lover's Lane. It was a close area that they all knew of because it had many different cul-de-sacs that had been built in, but the houses hadn't been built yet, meaning there was lots of empty space to be able to go do whatever you want. And so these nurses used it as kind of a place to go with their boyfriends to have some alone time, and it was even an unwritten rule that if somebody was already parked in one cul-de-sac, that somebody else would go down to the next one and just not bother them. So they figured maybe Jesse and Patricia went there. And when they got there, they found Jesse's abandoned car. It was a 1968 Ford Cortina, and nobody was inside. One of the nurses pushed out the tiny vent windows to unlock the car, and when they got inside, they noticed that there was jackets in the backseat, Patricia's purse, there was pantyhose neatly folded and tucked under the passenger seat, but there was no sign of a struggle. And this is finally when the Durham County Police Department got involved. Saturday came and went, Sunday came and went, the newspaper and media outlets were now talking about it as a missing persons case, and it was slowly being turned into a full-blown investigation because obviously something was not right the longer they were gone. Search parties were going through the woods near that area. They even had 3 airplanes circling. There was reward money, and there was tons and tons of rumors going around, which didn't help the investigation at all. It only hindered it because it was hard to decipher who was just telling a story that they had heard and who was telling factual information. Most who knew the couple said that if anything had happened to Patricia, then Jesse was already dead because he wouldn't have let anyone touch her. And the nurses began being very paranoid that somebody was out to get all of them, because in 1966 there was a serial killer named Richard Spevek who was attacking, torturing, and murdering nurses, 8 of them to be exact. And so this just made them super uncomfortable, thinking maybe there was a copycat because he was already arrested for it, but maybe there was a copycat or maybe somebody else attacking nurses, and maybe that was just the first one. There were so many tips coming in, some saying they'd seen Patricia at a restaurant, some saying they'd seen the couple buying rings somewhere. Some said it was a satanic cult because on their calendar February 12th was one of the days where they needed to sacrifice someone. Some said that Patricia had seen a man stealing medicine from the hospital she worked at, and that was possibly who could have done it. And then it was found that a man saying that he was Jesse's father had called Watts Hospital the night they went missing to ask if his son had gotten in a car accident. But his father didn't do that because he didn't yet know his son was even missing. And it was only 2 weeks later, on February 25th, when the news broke that 2 bodies had been found. Family members weren't even told yet when the media released it to the entire public. There was a surveyor who was named Robert Kirby who was trying to measure the property line between 2 houses in a heavily wooded area on the Durham-Orange County line when he saw what looked like a mannequin thigh among the leaves. He went over to inspect it when he found that it was actually a human body. There were 2. They were found tied back to back to a tree with rope around their hands and their necks. Jesse was found to still be wearing his class ring as well as a watch, and he had the car keys in his pocket as well as $4.63. Patricia was still wearing the pre-engagement ring Jesse had given her as well as a bracelet. They were both strangled to death, but there was no signs of sexual assault, but it did seem that Patricia had internal injuries as though she had been stomped or kicked or hit very hard. But there were little markings on their chest as though they had been slightly poked or prodded to make sure that they were dead. At the beginning, there were no leads or suspects to really look into. Of course, there were tons of people calling in, but everything just kept coming up inconclusive as far as the tests they were giving. They had a theory that it was 2 people that had done this, and because it was on the Orange County Durham line, there were many different departments who wanted in on this and who weren't willing to collaborate. They all had little different pieces that they didn't want to put together to make the full puzzle, which ultimately hindered this entire case. They began to write down all of the suspects that had been called in, the suspects they believed, and they went through them, but they found that most of them weren't realistic. They were being cleared by the test of the polygraph, and it was just getting harder and harder to find true suspects to go after. There was one man who lived in a mobile home across the street from where they were found named Vaden Newcomb, who was a grave digger who had bought a large supply of rope just a few days before this had happened. He had just gotten out of the military, he was dealing with PTSD, he had breakdowns a lot about that, and he was known as a peeping Tom, and he also quit his job the day after they went missing. Another man was Henry Aaron Tatum, who had already been arrested for the shooting of a man that he tied to a tree. In another murder, he was suspected of 2 of them, and when somebody said that to him, he said, "Make that 4." And so some believed that he had killed Patricia and Jesse as well. There was also a suspected in the military at the time and had been pen pals with Patricia, who they had been talking back and forth, and eventually this guy was on leave and he wanted to come see Patricia just before these murders happened, and Patricia kind of said that it was a bad idea, a bad time. All of her family were there and kind of dismissed the idea, and so it was theorized that possibly he was angry at her dismissal and went to go do something about it. But all of those were really ruled out, and there was a few that stayed in this case for a very, very long time as being suspects, but there was not enough evidence to arrest anybody. The investigators, they believed that whoever had done this knew the area well, and not just by going there once or twice. They would have to know that this area would be so secluded that nobody would hear the cries and the screams, because it was just out in the open, and if anybody would have heard him, he could have been caught. So he had to know this area was okay and knew exactly